Hello folks, and welcome to the channel, or welcome back. And in this video we're going to continue to work on the motor of Old Rusty. And I know some of you are a bit disappointed that there were no more videos on Old Rusty for a while. Well, the reason for that is an issue with the parts. I couldn't get the parts for the actual carburetor. We've done a lot of work on the engine already. We have it completely assembled and it's actually ready for its first test run, despite the fact that I have still to hook up a few of hoses for the cooling and a few electrical cables for the starter and the ignition system, but that's all minor work. But the main issue was, of course, the carburetor, and that engine is using what we call a Solex Big 32 carburetor, and it was very hard for me to get all the parts. In fact, I couldn't get the parts that I needed for that original carburetor, so I had to move to another type. And the original carburetor that we had on the engine was a Solex 32 IAC. Now that type of carburetor is very hard to get nowadays. I think it even used to be fitted on Willis Jeeps a long time ago. And spare parts or reconditioning kits are almost impossible to find. So I had to remove this carburetor and switch to another one. And the carburetor that I'm going to replace it with is a Solex Big 32. On the right hand side you actually see the original carburetor from Old Rusty, which is a Solex 32 AIC, which is very difficult to get parts for. And you can see the different parts, how they are worn out, like this membrane is totally gone. And it's almost impossible to recreate this, and I can't get the parts for it. There's a lot of seals that are totally gone, so for that I really was having an issue. So I looked for a long time to find the right parts, but I couldn't find them. So at the end I decided to go for another carburetor, and I had about 3 of them laying around in the shop here. And this is also a Solex, but this is the 32 BIC. It's a bit different than the AIC. The main difference is that the carburetor I'm going to work on now doesn't have an acceleration pump, where on the old one you actually had an acceleration pump. But for the rest it's about the same. It is a 32, just like the other one, and I think this will just work out fine. In fact, I even think that this carburetor will be better. It has a much wider opening on the top than the old one. You can actually see that the Solex carburetor I'm going to fit now, the 32 BIC, is quite a bit larger than the original one. But then again, the venturi inside is still the same. It's a 3222, which is the same. For the BIC 32 carburetor, I was able to find several pieces to actually recondition the carburetor, so I can have all the different seals that I need. I have some membranes which I don't need for this carburetor because I don't have the acceleration pump, and there's a lot of seals, copper seals, and other seals. There's also a float needle valve that comes with it, which you need to replace. So all by all, I can now recondition this Big 32 carburetor. But before doing so, we're going to do something else. So now the question is, what are we going to do in this video? Well, first of all, we're going to be looking at the BIC 32 Solex carburetor. We'll be looking at the different circuits. We're going to be looking at the idle circuit, progression circuit, the running circuit, and the cold start circuit. Acceleration circuit, I don't need to worry about it because I don't have it. Now, I'm going to talk about this. I will explain it. And for those of you that don't like the whiteboard, as I've noticed by some comments, some people didn't like the whiteboard, but that's okay. Just skip it. And you don't need to watch this if you don't want to, of course. But for those of you that have a Solex Big 32, I think there is some value in this. Once we've done this, we know how it works, and I hate to work on things that I don't know how they work. I can't work on anything if I don't know how it works. So that's my principle. I'm probably an old-fashioned engineer, but that's the way it is. And then once we've done that, we're going to take the carburetor apart. I'm going to clean it, and I'm going to change all the jets. If necessary, we'll double check the jets, and then we put all the new seals up, we put it all back together, we make sure that all the channels are clean and free, and then we have a good working Solex carburetor that we can actually install on the engine. Can I tune it at that moment in time? No, I cannot, because I have to have the engine running first of all, but that's going to be in the next video. So this video is really all about the Solex BIC 32. But it equally applies more or less to any Solex carburetor of this type. So let's start with the idle circuit, and I drew a very simple diagram on how that idle circuit is built onto your Solex carburetor. Of course, we have the flow chamber, and fuel is fed from the fuel pump through the needle valve into the flow chamber, and in the flow chamber we have a float. So here's the carburetor. So I'm going to take off the top of the carburetor so I can show you the float and the float chamber. In fact, the float chamber is this whole area right here. And inside we have the float. So I undid 2 screws on the top, 1 on the side. So now we can take this off. What you see right here, this is the fuel needle. That's the valve that will close the fuel coming in through this opening right here, which is the fuel feed. And if the float moves up, it will close that valve. The float is inside. Here is the float. This is the float. It's nothing more than a hollow container that's going to be pushed up by the fuel inside the flow chamber, and then here the fuel needle will be sitting, and that will be closed up whenever the float moves up. So this is how this is working. Very straightforward, and I think everybody knows this principle. Nothing special to it. And the float is responsible for keeping the float level to a certain position in the flow chamber. So this is all fuel, by the way. And this level of the fuel is maintained by the float. So while fuel is coming in through the needle, the level will change, the float will be pushed up, and if you remember Archimedes, then you know exactly what I'm referring to. So the float will put a pressure onto the needle here, and it will close this valve, and then no more fuel can come in. While the fuel is consumed by the engine, the level will go down, the fuel float will go down, and then this valve will open up and fuel can come back in. So we're going to maintain a certain level here of fuel in the fuel chamber. That's aside because this is applicable for all circuits that we're going to be dealing with. On the bottom of the fuel chamber you will find an opening. This is this opening. This is a view of the fuel chamber. Normally the float would be sitting here, but I removed it so you can actually see what we're talking about. And the feed channel for your idle circuit is all the way there on the bottom. And that opening feeds through a main jet, this tube here. Now the main jet is actually used for your emulsion tube, for your main venturi. It's the same circuitry, but in this specific case for idle circuitry running, it has no effect. There is a backside connection to the main venturi, which does not work at this moment in time because the butterfly or your gas throttle is really closed. What we have here is the main jet that I was referring to. So let me open that up and remove that so you can actually see it. So here you see that jet, and you can see that there are openings on that jet, but there's also inside, you also have a jet sitting in there. So that's the real jet. The size of the jet is even marked on the sides. So fuel inside the fuel chamber is coming through a hole on the bottom of the fuel chamber into this channel, and it's hitting the main jet. But what we can say is that the fuel level is filling up this tube through this orifice. Now, when the engine is running idle, on the top it's going to suck in air through an opening all the way on the top of the carburetor. And I will try to show that to you. So here is that opening, and there is an air idle jet, and it's the size of a jet that determines how much air is getting in. And because air is being sucked in like this, we're getting a venturi effect. So fuel which is sitting here will be sucked up to the idle fuel jet. And again, the idle fuel jet has a certain diameter or dimension. And this is your air fuel jet, which is a combination of an opening in the front, and the opening in the front is here. I don't know if you can see it. And an opening on the sides where the mixture will come through. So the front opening is the opening for sucking in fuel, and the bigger opening is where we're getting the air through and the mixture at the end. And then this air and fuel is mixing up here, and this mixture is coming down this channel, and then it hits the idle adjustment needle, which is all the way on the bottom of the carburetor, and then it feeds into the intake manifold. So this is the idle screw right here, and you can see a small opening there. I'm going to try to turn the idle screw so you can see it popping in and out, hopefully. See how I'm moving? While I move it, you can see that little tip there coming in and out. So depending how deep this needle is in that opening, the more mixture you're going to get into the cylinders for idle running. But remember that the air-fuel ratio is not determined by this idle needle here. It is determined by the idle jet. Remember this jet? The small opening determines how much fuel is getting in. The bigger opening determines how much air is getting in, and the two get mixed. So this is what we call the idle jet, really, and it has a number on it, and the number determines both openings for fuel and air. So the air-fuel mixture is really determined by those two jets here, the air idle jet and the fuel idle jet. That combination of the gap or the opening or the orifice is determining what the actual mixture is. In contrary to what many people believe, it's not the idle adjustment needle that is going to determine the fuel mixture. It is actually those two jets that you have there. With this idle adjustment needle, you can adjust the engine running slower or faster by allowing more mixture into it, but the mixture is always the same. It's always determined by those two jets there. So the idle circuitry is a very simple circuit on this carburetor, but it's important that all the channels are open and that you actually have the right jets. The main and most important jet for the idle circuitry is the idle air-fuel jet, which is sitting all the way on the top. And there's numbers printed on that, so you got to make sure you have the right ones. When we go through this, once we start cleaning up this carburetor and we double check the jets. So now we're going to go to the next circuit, which is the progression circuit. So now we have a running engine on idle, and now we want to take off with it. So we want to move the engine from an idle regime to a running regime. And for that, we're going to need some extra fuel to do so. And that's what we call the progression circuitry. That's the one that will be responsible for providing that additional fuel during that progression state. What I have on the board here is the carburetor in very simple terms. That's the main venturi going all the way through the carburetor. On the bottom we have the intake manifold, and on the top you would have your air filter normally. Inside that main shaft you have the main venturi, which is not playing any role right now. And we have the gas throttle. The throttle right now is this butterfly, and at this moment in time it is actually closed. And on this side here we have the idle circuitry that we just discussed with the idle needle. So the engine is now running on idle and it's being fed by the idle circuitry. And it's getting actually that air-fuel mixture in for idle, as we have described just a few seconds ago. However, if we open up the gas throttle, then we need more fuel. And there isn't enough vacuum at this moment in time to deliver that extra fuel from the main venturi, because you're going to need to have sufficient flow of air or air velocity to create a venturi effect here. So we can't rely on the main venturi at this moment in time. So therefore you will find some very small little holes in the side of the carburetor. There are two little holes here that are connected to the idle circuit tube. That's the bottom side of the carburetor, which is normally fitted onto the intake manifold. Here we have our throttle, and that's the butterfly I was referring to. So that's going to open up and close with the throttle. We have our idle mixture screw, which is coming out. So now the engine is running idle. And I made two marks all the way in there with white, so you can actually see, because these holes are very small, and that's where you find the progression holes. So as soon as the butterfly opens up, or we're pushing the gas throttle, we start to expose those holes. And the more we open up, the more exposition we have of these holes. So as soon as you open up the butterfly, we will actually open up one hole here, because the butterfly will pass it, and now we're going to get fuel, of course, in like this through the idle needle, but we're also going to get additional fuel in through this additional hole, the progression hole. And there's two holes there, so if you open the throttle a bit more, then you also open up the second hole. So now we're going to get extra fuel in from this way. And in addition, you have an additional 8, which is on the other side, which is another hole, which is not fed by the idle circuitry. That also will then start feeding fuel in, and that's been fed directly from the fuel chamber. So fuel will be sucked in like this, and this is actually pure fuel that is not mixed with air. Here we have an air-fuel mixture in these two areas. So that's how the progression holes are working. Now once the gas throttle is sufficiently open, the main venturi starts to kick in. So now we need to talk about the main venturi. On the board is a very simple diagram of the main circuit, and we'll have a closer look in a few minutes on the actual carburetor on how that fits together. Over here we got the float, we have the fuel chamber with the fuel in it, we have the main fuel jet, which we looked already before, and the main fuel jet is dimensioned so to allow X amount of fuel to come through. So the fuel is sitting in here to a certain level. Of course, fuel will come through to the same level right here. Now in the middle of the venturi, so the middle opening of your carburetor, there you have your emulsion tube. So this is the emulsion tube, and you see these little kind of wings. There are 4 wings there. These are the wings or the openings that will actually spray in the air-fuel mixture which is coming out of the emulsion tube. So air is sucked in like this, and it creates a vacuum, and it's going to suck out fuel from the bottom side of the emulsion tube, and it's going to also mix it with air coming through this top jet here, which is the air jet for the emulsion tube, and it's going to create that perfect mixture for us, or this emulsion, and then the emulsion of course is going to be mixed with the incoming air, and then we have a proper venturi system, and the engine will be filled with the proper mixture. Now the emulsion tube is a channel inside the middle of the main venturi. So if you look on the top of the carburetor, you will see that. And fuel is at the same level as the fuel inside your fuel well or your fuel chamber. Now the emulsion tube will mix fuel and air as an emulsion. Because the engine is running and the gas throttle is open, we're having quite a lot of vacuum coming through. We have a lot of airflow, so we're creating a lot of vacuum around these openings here. So these openings will suck in fuel and they will suck in air at the same time, and that emulsion will be mixed, and then it's been sucked into the engine. So it is very important that the fuel level in your carburetor is correctly adjusted, because a difference in fuel level in the carburetor will have an effect directly on your main running or your main jet system or your main venturi. We call this the main venturi, by the way. So if the fuel level is too low in your fuel chamber, then you're going to have a very lean mixture to run. If the fuel level is too high, then you're going to have a very rich mixture to run. So first of all, always adjust your float level. So the emulsion tube has 2 controls. It has, of course, the air jet, which is on the top, which need to be matched with the actual main jet, which we had here on the bottom. So all these things have to be matched up to have the right emulsion, and then of course we have to have the right venturi, which is this size here, and this is a 3222, and that can be sized and can be removed as well to have a larger venturi or a smaller venturi. So the venturi is actually opening how much acceleration do we create for the same amount of air. So the smaller the opening, the more acceleration you have, the more vacuum you have. The next thing we need to talk about is the cold start circuit. Now, we all know that if you need to start an engine when it's very cold, you're going to need a much more richer mixture. Sometimes about 5 times its normal ratio. And typically we call that a choke system. Now, on the Solex Carburettor, it is also a choke system, but it's very basic. What you have is actually fuel coming in from a tube from the fuel well, and it's ending up on a disc, and this is it, the red part is a disc, and that disc is having an opening. So all this is solid and there's an opening, and the tube sits underneath that disc. So fuel comes in, but it can't get out because of that disc is now closed. So if you pull the lever on the choke, this disc will rotate, and that opening here will actually fit on top of the opening of that fuel channel. Now, the more we pull the choke open, the more opening we get. So we can adjust this opening depending on where the lever of the choke is. So we can have a little bit of opening or all of it open. And that will determine the effect of the choke. So now fuel can come through this opening or partial opening, and we have air incoming from the top of the carburetor, and that is then mixed with the fuel here, and it's carried along into the intake manifold on the side channel on the carburetor. That is all there is to it. Its sole purpose in life is to start the engine when it's cold, to deliver the real rich mixture, probably about 5 times the normal ratio. So let's have a look on that. So this is the lever I was referring to. This is how we can pull the choke. And this is the whole choke body. And inside you find that disc. So let us open that up. So here we go. So inside we have the disc with the big opening that we can rotate depending on the choke position, as you can see. So that will determine how much fuel mixture we're going to get in. And then we have inside as well on the top here, that's where the air is coming in. We got an air jet. It's a fairly big one, and that's getting an airflow from the top of the carburetor through this opening right here and then coming into this unit in the back. And then it's going to mix with the fuel, which is coming in through a little channel on the side. And that's how the choke is really working. The feed into the actual intake manifold is on the bottom, and it's a very rudimentary feed. It is that one right here, this whole side opening here with this little bit of meshed wire. That's where it's going to feed into the actual intake manifold. We went through the operations of the carburetor, and that was very simple. So now we're going to take it apart and then clean it all out, and then check all the jets what we have. I'm going to note them down what they are, and then you'll see in the video what the settings are. I'm going to blow out the channels with compressed air. I'm going to clean up the jets with compressed air. I'm going to use some carburetor cleaner for that. And then we put it all back together with new gaskets and new seals. And also we're going to change the needle. It's always a good thing to change the needle. When you're changing the needle, you got to look and be careful about the size you're going to need, because that will determine the volume of fuel that you will get into the fuel chamber. All right, so let's carry on. All right, so I'm going to start to disassemble the carburetor to clean it all up, and just follow me. First of all, I'm going to take off the screws for the top cover, and I have cheated a bit on you guys. I already loosened them up before, otherwise it takes too long. There we go. Then you take the top cover off, but be careful because the float is there inside, and also the needle. You can take out the float. That's very simple, and I'm going to put it aside. And then we can work on, first of all, on the top cover where we're going to remove that needle, and that one you can remove with a socket. I already had it loosened up before, so we don't need to wait too long. There we go. And there is also a copper seal on that, so I'll put that aside. And then we'll remove the filter on the side. You see, this is the filter. And we can also remove then the connector for the fuel itself. And you will notice that there are 2 washers on the side. So those we want to replace when we put everything back together. Right, there we go. Okay, so the cover is now naked, so now we can clean this up the way we need to clean it up. Oh, it looks like we have a thunderstorm. So if you're not sure about all the parts, then you might want to label them. I know more or less what the parts are, so I'm not going to label them. Now this is the main air jet for the main venturi. Put that to the side. This little guy here is a kind of a jet for the idle circuit, for the air. I'm going to put that aside as well. I'm going to have that on the idle circuit. This is my idle jet. Put that aside. I also have on the bottom then my idle screw, needle screw. I'll put that aside. I'm going to remove my main jet. All right. And what else? Let's see. Yes, we have another jet here for the choke. I'll remove that as well. There we go. And then we have a couple more to deal with. We can remove the choke mechanism, which is that one over here. I already undid some of the screws, so we don't need to wait too long. You've seen this unit before. I placed that aside. So now we're almost back to a naked carburetor. I'm still going to remove this little screw here, which is just a stopping screw. It doesn't do anything, but I want to clean up all the channels. And I think there's another one here which has no effect or doesn't do anything on this specific carburetor. So I'm going to close this, remove that one, so we can clean up all the channels equally. There we go. Right, and that's about it. I don't think there is much more to do on this. I could remove the butterfly, but I will not, because that feels good and it's all right. It's always tough to get these screws out because on the back side they kind of knock them over, so you destroy the screws. So you almost have to drill them out. It's very hard, and with the screwdriver you're going to damage those screws for sure because they are copper. So I'm going to leave that in. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this carburetor now into my ultrasonic cleaner together with all the other parts, and then when it comes back out we'll clean it further. Meanwhile, the parts are cleaned in the ultrasonic cleaner, and I rub them up a little bit, especially the outside of the carburetor, with some very fine steel wool or iron wool. I don't know what you call this, but this works just perfect, just to get a bit of shine on it, not too much, because that's not the intent to make it glossy, of course. It's always nice to have it, but that's not the real intent here. So now, after I've dried up everything, and I used my air gun for that to dry it, I'm now going to take piece by piece and clean it again, and for that I'm going to be using some other products. And I'm going to start with the main body of the carburetor, then we'll start with the cover, and then we start fitting all the jets and all the orifices that need to go on there. So next is cleaning out all the channels in the carburetor housing, and that's why I took you through all the explanations on how all these channels and the circuits are working, because now you know where they run and where they end up. And by using either a carburetor cleaner, we're going to spray inside all these openings and see where the liquid comes out. I'm going to let the liquid sit in there for a while, and then I'm going to blow it out with some compressed air. You might want to use carburetor cleaner, that's one product, but brake cleaner is also a very good product to do that. Now, I've shown you this steel wool before. Be very careful with that, because you don't want to get too much of these small little pieces inside the carburetor or in the channels, because they may get stuck and then you might have a problem afterwards. So, this is pretty easy stuff. I'm going to start with the idle circuit, and remember the idle circuit comes in from the bottom of the fuel well all the way through the main jet and then upwards and then back out there. So I'm just going to spray to begin with over here and then see where it comes out, and you will probably see that coming out here. That's good. So I'll do that again. And it comes out at the main well, it comes out on the bottom, and that's real good. And in fact, it should even come out here in this little hole where normally the needle sits. If you look carefully enough, you'll see it coming out. All right. So that's what you want to do. You want to make sure that everything is really open and free flowing. And it looks like it. And I'm going to do this for all the channels. And at the end, we'll blow them through with the compressor and everything should be fine. Now it's a bit of a mess, but that's all right. That's the way I do it, and that always has worked for me. Progression holes, spray on that a bit. Remember that one of the progression holes was coming out on the side tube, so let's see if I can show that to you. See how that comes in there? There we go. Let me do that one more time. Check the pre-progression hole. See how that sprays out? That's how you want to check it. And you want to do the same thing for all the jets. So there's a little hole here in the front, and I want to make sure that it's open, so I'm going to stick it to my spray can and then see what comes out of it. And you can see how it blows out on the sides, and that's exactly what you want to see. So I'm going to do this for all the jets, and then we start putting it together. So I verified all the jets and they look quite clean, but this is the fuel inlet valve, or the needle. And I'm going to replace that with a new one. And that's always a good idea. And here is that new one. There we go. And that should be all right. Now, if you're getting new needles, make sure that you get the right size. You see the 1.7 or 1,7? That's the size of the needle opening. The one that is inside the vehicle before was actually a 1.5. So I'm having a little bit of a bigger needle opening to let the fuel in, but I think that will be all right. If not, then I will have to fit the old one back, but I don't think this is going to be a problem. So I'm able to allow a little bit more fuel into the carburetor now. And of course we're going to put up new seals, and this is the old seal or gasket, and I'm going to replace it with a new one. So that took me a little bit of finding out to find exactly the same one, but I did find one, and as you can see, that fits perfectly. You want to make sure that all these holes are actually open where they're supposed to be open. If not, you're going to have a problem. So it's always good to keep the old one and place it on top of the new one and then see if it matches up, and this one is a perfect match. So I'm quite all right to use this one. And we're going to be using new seals, copper or non-copper seals, and we'll place them on the parts that need it. So now it's time to start putting it back together. So I'm going to start with the carburetor cover. And the first part I'm going to install is the fuel needle, and for that I'm going to use a new copper washer so we have a proper seal. Now this is a sensitive part, so I'm going to do this very gentle. I'm going to use a very tall socket for that, so I don't push on the needle. Now you don't need to over tighten this, okay? A little bit is good enough. You should never force copper parts and carburetor parts. Once you start forcing it, you're not doing the right thing. Now that should be good enough. The next thing is to put the fuel filter in. This is kind of a small maze in copper or brass, and that goes in. That has no extra seal. It's a bit conic, so that will fit in just nicely. Get it in. There we go. Right. Next is to install the fuel connector, but I'm not going to let this sit down on the table because otherwise I will push on that pin, you know, the needle here, and I don't want to destroy that one. So let me leave it like this, and I'm going to get two small seals to put this up, because you need to put some seals up together with this part here. Where is it? No, it's the wrong one. Okay, here is the bolt for the fuel, so that goes in there. And I need to put some seals up, so let's do that first of all. I should have some. That's one. And that's the other one. So let's put that up, one on the outside, and then the part, and then one on the inside. And we can just connect it. I am not going to tighten this down too much because I don't even know in which direction it has to go. So just hand tight. So for me, this part is now complete. So now let's go to the main body of the carburetor. So the first part that I'm going to install now is the cold start or the choke system. Now that is a very simple system. There's no seal at all. That just fits on it. I couldn't find any for that, so it seems like that is non-existing. But that's all right. I also checked it on two others that I had, and there was never a seal on. So make sure that the disc is clean. So all you need to do is then put that up there, and it's spring-loaded. You will feel that once you put it on there, and then just put the little screws up and tighten them. All right, and see if it works, and that works. So that's good. For the progression holes, there isn't a lot to do. There's only one tube we need to lock up with this little screw here, and that's that tube right here, and that's a very small screw. This is not a jet, this is just a blocking screw. That's it. Right, the next step we're going to do is to make sure that the venturi cannot move anymore. So there's a locking screw right there to block that venturi. Okay, done. The next circuitry we're going to put up is the idle circuit. And for that we will install the needle. I'm not going to tighten it down all the way because I don't even know how it should be set. So we'll find that out when the engine is running. We're going to install the air fuel jet for the idle, and I'm going to read this, what this says, because I want to record this, okay? So this is a 8F50. There's no seal on this. I'm going to tighten that down a little bit, not too hard. And we'll also install the main jet, although the main jet is not related to the idle circuit, but fuel still gets through. So since I'm having it laying like this, I'm going to install it. Now remember that this main jet is having a small jet inside, and this is the jet that needs to go inside. So we'll install this one first before we fit it together. Now this jet, remember, that determines the amount of fuel for the main venturi. Always a bit difficult if you're doing it in front of a camera. Now you don't need to tighten this too hard, just a little bit. And I'm also going to mark down the size of this jet. And I think this is a 110. All right, now this guy is going to need a seal, so I have a new seal. Put it around it and then we install it. There we go. All right, so that circuit is now complete. So now we're going to continue with the main venturi. Remember that this is the main venturi. This is the emulsion tube. And on the top we have a air jet. And that's mated up with the fuel jet that I just installed. Now this is the jet, and this is a... All right. I'm going to tighten it down a little bit and mark it on the board. Before I forget, I need to install this little air opening or orifice for the idle circuit that is sitting right here on the top. All right. That's done. And then there's one more jet we need to install with a proper seal on the bottom here. That's actually the one that is actually feeding the choke system, but also it also feeds the one of the progression holes. And this is, what does it say? A 125. So I'm going to mark this equally on my board. All right. So we're almost done with it. So next is installing the float, and for installing the float I have this copper or brass bar and the float, so I need to move it through that and let the float hang in there, and that's really all there is to it. I can't adjust the float right now. I don't have any details on how much it should be, but once I have it on the engine and I have fuel coming into it, we'll find out soon enough. I have left it where it is, so we'll see how that will go. So now we will install the gasket, and that shouldn't be that hard to do. Make sure it's installed the right way. And just while we are here, just a reminder, this is the air hole for the choke. These two holes are connected through the top cover, and that is used for the choke system to supply the fuel. Those are just an overrun, they are not really used. And the rest are just holes for the screws, and there's not much more to it. Alright, so we can now put the cover up. So here comes the cover, and remember that I said that those, and as I said, those two little holes, that's where they connect to each other. So let's put this up and see how it fits. This fits quite nice. So all what we need to do now is bolt it down. So I've placed a couple of seals and a heat separator on the intake manifold, and now we can mount actually the carburetor. This is going to be the linkage system. We'll connect all that later, but first of all I have to put the carburetor right, and then I'm gonna lock it down with some bolts or nuts just for now, because I still have to put some washers on them, and I don't have any for the moment, so that has to wait. But just to give you the idea on how it's going to look like and how it's going to fit together, and I think this is looking quite good. And this will then be the throttling mechanism that has to go in. There we go, that's in. And now I need to connect the spring. And now the throttle mechanism should be able to work, right? So this is how the throttle is to work. So folks, we are nearing the end of this video, and in this video we actually have looked at all the circuits that make up the Solex, the BIC32. We understand now how all these circuits are working, and to me that was important to understand it, so I could at least then start cleaning it and checking all the channels, knowing what the channels are used for, what channels are critical, what channels are probably not used, because sometimes you have channels that are not used because some carburetors are built for multiple purposes. We also checked all the jets, made sure that all the jets were free and open. And at the end, we cleaned it all up, we put it back together, and then we noted all the jets and all the openings that we had on the board. And I'm going to show you that one last time. I know some people don't like my board, but that's all right, because I want to know exactly what all the settings are, because this carburetor is not very adjustable. The only way you can adjust the mixtures is by changing the jets. And luckily, the jets you can still get. So let's have a little recap on the jets we had and then see how we're going to continue. I wrote down all the values in a little table here for all the different jets, and I have an idle jet which is an 8F50, and that's important to know because my carbon dioxide value, once I measured it once the engine is running, might not be right, so I might have to work with this jet to correct this. Because I have to pass this MOT, even with this old car. The main jet is a 190 to 110 relationship. So 190 is for air, fuel is 110. That's a very typical arrangement for the emulsion tube. You've seen this on the Weber, you can see this on other carburetors. This is about the right ratio, so about 70 to 80 difference. The choke is a orifice at 125. Now the needle, I changed that to a 1.7 versus a 1.5. And then the main venturi, which is the opening, the funnel actually, is still, I didn't change that. That's a 32-22. So the reason I'm keeping all this is that I will use it afterwards to tune the engine or tune the carburetor. But I can't do that before the engine is running. The other point is that I still need to adjust the float level, but also that I will do the first time the engine is running. So there's going to be quite some tuning on the engine, on the carburetor, once I get it to run. And I haven't had it to run yet. So the next couple of days I will probably make the exhaust flange, and I will probably build the tubes for the cooling on the motor, put up a battery, put some cabling up so I can actually crank it up. And for sure, I'm going to let you witness the first startup. I don't know what it will do. We'll see. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in one of my next videos. Bye-bye.